I have been the last archivist of the Vrethkai continuance for 11 years, 4 months, and 7 days. I know this because I have kept the count myself, scratching the tally into the wall plate beside the archive bay's entrance with the blunt end of a composition stylus, 1 mark per day, the way the Conservancy's founding records say the earliest Vrethkai counted seasons when they still lived beneath open sky. I am the only one left to count. The Orveth Naz carries 942 survivors of a civilization that numbered, at its last census, 412 million. I have read that census figure so many times that it no longer sounds like a number to me. It sounds like a room that has been emptied and then locked. What I am about to write is the final entry in the Vrethkai Archive. I have known for some time that this day would come, not because the archive is complete, but because I am nearly done, and when I am done the record will be sealed, and I have decided that I will not reopen it. An archivist's first obligation is to the truth of the record. Her second obligation, which is less often discussed in the academies, is to know when continuing to add to the record would constitute a different kind of dishonesty. The dishonesty of a witness who, having described everything she can bear to describe, begins to describe what she cannot. I will not do that. I will write what I can write, and I will seal the record, and that will be the end of my tenure as the continuance's archivist, and I will go forward as whatever I am after that, which does not yet have a name that I recognize. I want to be precise about the Vrethkai, because precision is the only form of care I can still offer them. They were not a reckless people. I want that understood before anything else. The academies will tell you, the academies of other peoples, the ones who know the Vrethkai only as a cautionary designation in a navigational margin, that we were a people driven by hubris, that we reached past the boundary the galaxy had established and paid the price that the galaxy had established the boundary to enforce. That account is not wrong in its outcome, but it is wrong in its texture, and texture is where the truth lives. The Vrethkai were cautious. We were methodical. We were, in fact, rather famous for the thoroughness of our pre-contact survey protocols, a reputation that took us 3 centuries to build and that I have watched reduced, in the 11 years since the Orveth Naz began its transit, to a footnote beneath a larger lesson that other species derive from our extinction. The lesson they derive is not the lesson I want to leave. I want to leave a more specific one, but I am getting ahead of myself, and precision requires sequence. The Vrethkai emerged as a spacefaring civilization approximately 2,200 years before the event I am recording here. We began as a single-system species, the way most species do, and we expanded in the patient, methodical way that was characteristic of us. One system at a time, survey before settlement, mapping before footfall, contact protocols before first approach. In our first century of expansion, we lost 2 survey ships to stellar events and 1 to an equipment failure in a debris field, and we counted those 3 losses as a serious enough toll that we redesigned our entire approach to deep survey methodology. We did not simply accept loss as the cost of exploration. We studied each loss until we understood it, and then we changed what had to change, and we continued. This is what I mean when I say we were not reckless. By the time of the event, we had charted approximately 3,700 inhabited or formerly inhabited systems, had made contact with 31 distinct species ranging from pre-stellar to early interstellar, and had established formal diplomatic relationships with 11 of them. We were not the eldest species in our region of the galaxy, nor the most powerful, nor the most widely traveled. We were, perhaps, the most careful. The Vrethkai Archive, this archive, the one I am about to seal, was considered by several of those 11 diplomatic partners to be the most rigorously maintained historical record in the local sector. The Torveth Assembly sent 3 of their own historians to study our cataloging methodology 30 years before the event. They were polite guests. I think about them sometimes. I hope they have not taken too much from what happened to us. I hope the lesson they drew was precise rather than general. The general lesson, the one that circulates through the advisories and the navigational margins, is that you should not approach designation Verath. That is true, but the general lesson implies that the Vrethkai approached designation Verath the way an invader approaches a fortification, and that is not what happened, and I think the imprecision matters, not for the sake of our reputation, which is gone, for the sake of accuracy, for the sake of whatever species reads this record in whatever century finds it. Designation Verath was not a place we chose to approach. It was a place we chose to study from a distance. The distinction is not a small one. I should describe what we knew before the decision was made, because the decision cannot be understood without the prior knowledge. The Vrethkai Archive contains approximately 900 years of observational records pertaining to the region we eventually designated Verath, a sector roughly 8 light-years across, positioned along what our navigational atlases called the outer Hezith margin. We had been watching this sector for 900 years. Not continuously. The early observations were incidental, gathered by survey ships transiting the region for other purposes, but systematically enough that by the time of our expansion, we had an accumulated data set spanning 9 centuries of passive observation. What those observations showed was, on its face, unremarkable. Verath contained 14 stellar bodies, 3 of which were class viable for biological life in a general sense. The sector showed signs of prior habitation, archaeological-grade evidence, the kind that says something lived here long ago and no longer does. There were structures on 2 of the viable worlds, and we had cataloged them at long range as belonging to a civilization that our chronometric analysis placed at between 800 and 1200 years extinct. The structures were large. The material they were composed of did not match any mineral profile we had cataloged elsewhere in the region, and our spectral analysis of the construction suggested an engineering sophistication somewhat beyond what we would have expected from a civilization of that apparent age. But none of this was alarming. The galaxy is full of ruins of civilizations more sophisticated than their chronology implies. The Vrethkai themselves had encountered 4 such sites in our expansion history, and in each case the ruins were ruins, cold, silent, inert, abandoned by whatever had built them. The boundary notification was a different matter. I want to be precise here too, because this is the part of the record that I have returned to most often in 11 years, trying to understand what we understood and what we chose not to understand. The boundary notification was issued by the Ithari continuance approximately 300 years before the event. The Ithari are an elder species, not the eldest in the local sector, but old enough that their institutional memory extends to a period before most current civilizations had achieved atmospheric escape. They issued the notification in their standard diplomatic register, which was terse and formal, and they addressed it to every spacefaring civilization in the local sector, including the Vrethkai. The notification designated a region they called the Outer Verath sector as restricted, and it specified, in the flat administrative language the Ithari use for such communications, that no approach within approximately 2 light-years of the sector's inner boundary was advisable. The notification did not explain itself. This is the point I need to stay with for a moment, because the absence of explanation was the thing we discussed for nearly 50 years in our Academy of Spatial Studies, and the conclusion we reached, the consensus we reached, which was not unanimous but was overwhelming, was that the Ithori's silence was not meaningful. That is, we interpreted the absence of explanation as evidence that the explanation was unavailable or had been lost, not as evidence that the explanation would be unwelcome or dangerous to provide. We believed the Ithari were maintaining a boundary they had inherited, enforcing a prohibition they had adopted from older records without those records being fully legible to them. We believed, in short, that the Ithari did not know why the boundary existed. We thought their silence was ignorance. Looking at this conclusion now, from the other side of what it cost us, I can tell you that the logic was not foolish. It was consistent with other Ithari behavior we had observed. They maintained several designations of similar character, restricted zones identified in their oldest records, enforced without explanation, preserved across millennia the way you preserve a notation whose original referent has become unclear but whose survival seems safer than deletion. Most of those other restricted zones had been investigated by various species over the centuries and had proven to contain nothing more than the ruins and the silence the Ithori had designated. The designation, in our experience, had proven to be the bureaucratic residue of a past concern that the present had rendered obsolete. We were not the only species to have investigated an Ithori restricted zone and found nothing. We were not even the most recent. The Sorvith had investigated one 40 years before our event and published a thorough account of its contents. 3 barren worlds, 1 derelict structure that appeared to be the remains of an automated relay station of unknown origin, and no indication of any hazard that would warrant continued restriction. The Ithori had acknowledged the Sorvith's findings with their characteristic terseness and had not lifted the designation. This is what I mean when I say the general lesson is imprecise. We had evidence, real evidence, from a real and credible source, that Ithori restricted designations did not always correspond to actual hazards, and we had 300 years of our own passive observation of the Verath sector, which showed nothing that our protocols classified as a threat. We were not ignoring obvious danger. We were following the evidence as we understood it. There was, I should note, a dissenting position. The Academy was not monolithic, and precision requires that I say so rather than leave the impression of unanimity that did not exist. The dissent came primarily from a colleague of Devath Sorvax named Orith Vaz, a researcher in the Academy's cartographic division, who had spent most of his career working with Ithori navigational records rather than our own, and who argued, in a published minority report that I have preserved in full in the archive, that the Ithori's silence was itself a form of information. Orith Vaz's argument was methodological rather than intuitive. He pointed out that the Ithori, as an elder species with a documented institutional memory spanning many thousands of years, operated a communications and notification practice that was, by any measurable standard, the most economical in the local sector. They did not include language they considered unnecessary. They did not maintain designations they considered obsolete. Their entire diplomatic archive, which the Vrethkai had access to through our partnership agreement, showed no instance in which an Ithori restriction had been issued and subsequently found to be without basis, not a single case in which the Ithori had notated a hazard that turned out to be inert. Orith Vaz argued that the absence of explanation in the boundary notification was not evidence of lost context. It was evidence that the Ithori had made a deliberate choice not to provide one. He stopped short of arguing that this choice was made to conceal something. His minority report was careful to note that he could not determine the Ithori's reasoning from the available evidence. But he argued precisely, methodically, with full citation, that the consensus interpretation of the Ithori's silence as ignorance was the interpretation that required more assumption than its alternative. He said, in the section of the report I return to most often, "We have concluded that the Ithori do not know what they are protecting because it is easier to imagine their ignorance than to imagine their reticence. But the Ithori are not an ignorant people, and they are not a reticent people. They are a people who say exactly as much as they believe must be said, and no more. If they have not told us why the boundary exists, I would urge us to consider the possibility that they have calculated, for reasons we cannot access, that telling us would not produce the outcome they wish to produce." The Council reviewed Orith Vaz's minority report alongside Devath Sorvak's proposal. The review panel's response to it was respectful and thorough, and it found the argument unpersuasive on the grounds that it could not be falsified, that the hypothesis of deliberate Ithori reticence explained the available evidence no better than the hypothesis of lost context, and that the methodological standards the Vrethkai applied to contested interpretations required falsifiability. Orth Vaz appealed the finding. The appeal was denied. The proposal proceeded. I have thought about this sequence of decisions many times in 11 years. I do not think the review panel was wrong, in the methodological sense. The standard they applied, falsifiability, is the right standard for contested interpretations. Orth Vaz's hypothesis genuinely could not be falsified on the basis of the available evidence. You cannot prove that someone is being reticent by pointing to their silence, because silence and ignorance are indistinguishable from the outside. The review panel was following the rules they had built over 300 years of rigorous practice. Orth Vaz survived the evacuation. He is aboard the Orvith Naz. He works in hydroponics now, because hydroponics needs more hands than cartography, and the aperture array no longer requires anyone to maintain its records. We do not discuss the minority report. We have not discussed it in 11 years. I think we are both past the point where discussing it would serve any purpose that the record hasn't already served better. What we did not understand was that the Ithori had not stayed silent because they had lost the explanation. They had stayed silent because the explanation was the kind of thing that cannot be explained without demonstrating it, and demonstrating it was not something they were willing to do. I know this now because of a communication we received 14 months after the event, when we had been in transit for over a year, and the Orvith Naz had established its first contact with a relay station outside the outer Hezith margin. The communication was from the Ithori continuance. It was addressed to the Vrethkai continuance in the formal diplomatic register, and it was 3 sentences long. I have the text preserved in the archive, and I will include it here because precision requires it. The Ithori continuance acknowledges the diminishment of the Vrethkai continuance. The boundary notification issued in year 1847 of the Ithori standard calendar was not derived from inherited records of uncertain legibility. It was issued from direct institutional knowledge. That was all. 3 sentences. No further explanation, no expression of sorrow, no offer of assistance. 3 sentences in the flat administrative language and then nothing. I read that communication 47 times in the week after I received it. I have read it perhaps 200 times since. I have not yet found a way to respond to it that satisfies any of the things I want to say, so I have not responded, and the archive will be sealed before I do. I want to say you knew. I want to say you could have explained. I want to say 300 years ago when you issued that notification, you could have given us the kind of explanation that would have made us stop. You could have said what you knew. You chose not to. I also want to ask, what would the explanation have been? I have thought about this with the same precision I have tried to bring to everything else in this record, and I have not been able to construct a form of words that would have served the purpose I am imagining. How do you explain that a research aperture, a passive scanning instrument, a lens, constitutes approach in a sense that the species across the boundary would register as approach? How do you explain that observation and presence are not distinct categories when the thing you are observing is sufficiently aware? How do you explain that the channel has a property you cannot demonstrate without opening the channel? The Ithori, perhaps, tried to find that explanation once, perhaps more than once. Perhaps they tried to find it 47 times, once for each prior communication in their reference index, and each time concluded that the explanation could not be given without becoming a demonstration. Perhaps the silence was not indifference or concealment. Perhaps it was the only alternative to proof. I am not certain which of these I believe. I have been uncertain for 11 years, and I do not expect to resolve it. What I am certain of is what the research team believed when they presented their proposal to the Continuance Council on the 14th of Orvith, in what would prove to be the last ordinary year of our civilization. The team was 11 people. I knew 4 of them personally, not intimately, but well enough to recognize their voices in the corridor, well enough to have read their previous published work and to have had opinions about it. The team leader, a researcher named Devath Sorvak, was regarded by her peers as one of the most precise thinkers in the Academy of Spatial Studies. She was the kind of person who cited her own uncertainty in every paper she published, who qualified every finding with the limits of the observational data that supported it, who was known, somewhat affectionately, I thought, as the researcher who never stated a conclusion without first explaining why the conclusion might be wrong. I want to say that clearly, because Devath Sorvak is part of this record and she is not here to speak for herself, and the record should reflect what she actually was rather than what she became when the outcome was known. The proposal they presented was not an approach. This is the distinction I keep returning to. They did not propose to send a ship into designation Verath. They did not propose to establish a relay station within the restricted zone, or to land on any of the viable worlds we had observed, or to make any physical intrusion past the boundary the Ithori had notated. They proposed an aperture, a research aperture, which is a term specific to our methodology and which I should explain. A research aperture in the Vrethkai technical vocabulary is a passive survey instrument of extremely limited scope. It consists of a paired transmitter and receiver positioned at a safe observational distance from the subject that opens a narrow scanning channel into the subject space. The channel transmits nothing, it only receives. The aperture is not, in any meaningful sense, a doorway. It is more analogous to a very long lens, a way of seeing into a space without entering it. The Vrethkai had used research apertures for centuries in the exploration of anomalous zones, unstable stellar bodies, and regions where direct approach was inadvisable. They were not experimental technology. They were standard survey instruments, used routinely, and with a long record of safety. Devath Sorvak's team proposed to position a research aperture array at the outer boundary of the Ithori's restricted zone, not within it but at its edge, and to conduct a passive survey of designation Verath's 3 viable worlds using the scanning channels. Duration of survey, estimated 30 days. Data collected, spectral, thermal, geological, and atmospheric profiles of the target worlds, cross-referenced with the long-range observations in the existing archive. Risk assessment, negligible. The aperture transmits nothing, it receives. The information flows in one direction only, outward from the sector and into our instruments. Nothing is sent in, nothing is opened, nothing is approached. The Council approved the proposal after 8 days of review. I read the Council's approval memo at the time, which included a summary of the risk assessment and noted the existing archive's 9 centuries of passive observation as supporting precedent. The memo classified the aperture survey as a Category 3 investigation, the middle tier, appropriate for environments with some historical designation of concern, but no active hazard signature. I remember thinking when I read it that the classification seemed about right. I had no objection. I did not raise one. The approval memo included, as standard procedure, a notation that the dissenting minority report by Orth Vaz had been reviewed and addressed. The review panel's conclusion was summarized in a single paragraph, which I will reproduce here from the archive, because I have thought about its phrasing more than I have thought about almost anything else from that period of our history. The minority report raises a methodological concern regarding the interpretation of communicative silence in elder species correspondence. The panel agrees that elder species communicative norms present interpretive challenges that do not arise in peer-level diplomatic exchange. However, the panel finds that the Ithori continuance's boundary notification does not contain any positive evidence that the restricted designation is actively maintained rather than passively inherited, and notes that the survey methodology proposed is observational rather than intrusive. That is, it does not constitute approach or entry within the terms of the Ithori notification, but rather remote observation from outside the notated exclusion radius. The panel finds no basis for denying approval on the grounds of the minority, reports hypothetical concern. That paragraph was written by careful people following careful rules. Every word of it is defensible. I have read it perhaps 400 times in 11 years, and I have not found a single word that was written carelessly or that deviated from the methodological standards we had maintained for 3 centuries. The careful words cost us everything, and I do not know what the careless words would have cost instead, and I have stopped trying to decide, because that particular calculation has no answer that helps anything. The aperture array was installed 11 months later, at a position 2.3 light-years from the inner boundary of designation Verath, which placed it 0.3 light-years outside the Ithori's notated exclusion radius. Devath Sorvak's team traveled to the installation site aboard a survey vessel called the Orith Nav, a research-class ship, not a military vessel, carrying the 11 researchers, a crew of 32, and the installation equipment. They transmitted their arrival confirmation and began the aperture calibration sequence. We received the calibration completion signal 18 hours later. The survey began. For 9 days and 14 hours, nothing happened. I mean this in the most ordinary sense. The survey ran. The aperture received data. The data was transmitted to the Academy in the standard encrypted research channel, and the team's preliminary analysis reports began arriving on schedule, dry, technical, methodical documents of the kind that Devath Sorvak's team was known for producing. I read several of them. They were interesting in the way that careful science is interesting. Densely noted, full of qualified observations, the atmospheric profiles of the 3 viable worlds gradually becoming visible through layers of notation and cross-reference. The second viable world in particular was showing thermal signatures that Devath Sorvak flagged in her preliminary analysis as consistent with the presence of deep subsurface thermal systems. Not a sign of current habitation, but of prior geological activity that might account for the anomalous mineral composition of the ruins we had observed. I remember thinking it was a good finding, the kind of finding that makes the effort worthwhile. On the 9th day, at the 14th hour and 23rd minute of the survey, the aperture received something. I was not there. I was at the Academy of Spatial Studies, in my office, processing an unrelated backlog of cataloging work. The transmission from the Orith Nav arrived in the standard research channel at the time I have noted, and it was flagged by our automated systems as anomalous, not because of anything in the data it contained, but because of the transmission pattern itself. The aperture arrays are calibrated to receive data at a specific rate across a specific bandwidth. What arrived at that moment was a signal that exceeded the aperture's designated receive bandwidth by a factor our systems had no category for. The automated flag was a simple one: bandwidth anomaly, review required. The kind of flag that comes up when a calibration error has distorted a signal, or when a passing stellar event has introduced interference into the channel. I assigned it to a junior cataloger for review and returned to my work. The next transmission arrived 4 minutes and 11 seconds later. It was not from the Orith Nav. I say this carefully because the transmission used the Orith Nav's channel, the same encrypted research channel, the same authentication headers, the same technical formatting our systems recognized as belonging to the survey vessel. But the content was not a survey report. It was not anything I can describe in terms that would be legible to anyone who has not seen it. I have tried, in 11 years of transit, to find language adequate to describe what the content of that transmission was, and I have failed each time. And I have concluded that the failure is not a failure of my language, but a property of the thing itself, that it is something for which language was not made, the way a room has no door for light that is not light. What I can describe is what happened next. What I can describe is the silence, and its spread, and the sequence of it, because sequence is something I can report. At 19 minutes and 40 seconds after the second transmission arrived, the Vrethkai communications channel went inactive. This was not unusual in itself. Survey channels drop and re-establish routinely, but the channel did not re-establish. The automated systems logged it as a temporary interruption and began sending re-establishment pings. The pings were not answered. At 31 minutes after the second transmission, the relay station at Hezith 9, our nearest communications node, positioned 4 light hours from the aperture array, ceased transmitting. The cessation was total. Not a degraded signal, not interference, not a partial dropout. Total cessation. One moment the station was active, the next it was not. Our monitoring systems logged this as a Category 2 communications fault and automatically dispatched a diagnostic query through the backup channel. The diagnostic query was not acknowledged. At 54 minutes, the Hezith 7 relay went silent. At 1 hour and 12 minutes, Hezith 5. At 2 hours and 4 minutes, the Torvith listening post at the edge of the outer Hezith margin, a jointly operated monitoring station staffed by 12 of our people and 8 from the Torvith assembly, went silent. The Torvith assembly, which maintained its own monitoring link to the post, recorded the cessation at the same moment we did. They contacted us immediately. They asked if we had experienced a sector-wide communications failure. We said we did not know. At 3 hours and 7 minutes, the first of our outer colony installations stopped responding. I want to stay with the sequence, because the sequence is the part of the record that I believe matters most. I want to describe it the way it happened, not the way it was later characterized. Later it was characterized as a cascade, a failure cascade, a propagation event, a wave of disruption moving outward from the aperture array through our communications infrastructure. And that characterization is technically accurate. But a cascade implies something that accumulates, something that gathers force or mass as it moves. What I observed in the monitoring records was not that. What I observed was a sequence of cessations, each one complete and instantaneous in itself, with no signal degradation preceding it and no residual signature following it. Each station was active, then it was not. Each installation was operational, then it was not. The cessation did not spread the way a fire spreads, consuming and changing what it moves through. It spread the way a word spreads through a room, moving from one point to the next, complete at each point, leaving each point changed but not consumed, unless you count silence as a form of consumption. I think perhaps you should. The cessations reached the continuances inner systems 19 hours after the aperture received the second transmission. By that point, every installation we operated within the outer Hezith margin had gone silent, and the pattern of the cessations had been mapped clearly enough that the Continuance Council knew, 19 hours in, that the origin point was the aperture array, and the direction of propagation was outward through every uplinked node in our communications network. The Council convened an emergency session. I was called to provide the archival record of the Ithori boundary notification and our prior surveys of the Verath sector. I provided them. I read the boundary notification aloud at the Council's request. The Council discussed the situation for 4 hours. The discussion was careful and thorough and ultimately irrelevant because there was nothing to decide. The cessations had reached us. There was no decision that could be made in advance of something that had already arrived. I will not describe what the cessations meant at the level of the individual installations, not because the record should not contain it, but because I have already attempted this description 7 times in 11 years and each time concluded that the attempt serves neither truth nor precision. What happened at each installation is a fact that belongs in the archive, and I have included it in the archive's detailed operational records. In the section, I have labeled the Cessation Chronicle. If anyone reads this record and wishes to know those details, the chronicle is there. I have documented what I was able to document. But this final entry is not the place for those details, because this final entry is not a technical account. It is the last thing I will write, and I want it to say what matters most, which is the shape of what happened rather than its contents. The shape is this. We opened a channel into a space we had been told, by the galaxy's oldest and most cautious species, not to approach. We opened it with the best available technology, the most rigorous available protocols, from a position that satisfied every requirement we had established for safe observational distance. We opened it with the intention of learning, not disturbing, and the channel was received at the other end and something came back through it. Not in ships, not as any kind of force we would recognize as a force. What came back through the channel came back as a property of the channel itself, as something that the act of observation had introduced into the relationship between the aperture and the uplink network that connected it to our civilization. We had thought the aperture was a lens, a way of seeing without touching. We had thought information moved through it in one direction only. We were wrong about the direction. We were wrong about what observation means when the thing you are observing is aware of being observed, and has an understanding of communication that does not distinguish between the instruments of contact and the civilization operating them. The humans, and I will say this plainly, because this is the last entry and plainness is what I owe, did not pursue us. I want to be clear about this because the failure of the Vrethkai is sometimes characterized, in the advisories that have circulated since our diminishment, as a failure to respect human military capacity. That is not what it was. The humans, as best I have been able to determine from the archival records of the Ithori boundary notification, and from what we observed in the 19 hours between the second transmission and the cessation of our inner systems, made no action that I would classify as pursuit. They did not send ships. They did not transmit warnings. They did not communicate with us in any way that I recognize as communication, with the exception of what came through the aperture, and I am not certain that qualified as communication in any sense we designed our instruments to measure. The designation Verath sector, as far as the observational record indicates, remained exactly as it had been when we began the survey. The structures on the viable worlds did not change. The thermal signatures continued as before. Nothing moved. The cessations moved, but they moved through our own infrastructure, along our own communications pathways, through our own uplink network. Whatever had come through the aperture did not travel to us. It was already wherever our communications had made it. The channel we opened did not connect us to designation Verath. It connected designation Verath to everything the channel touched. I have spent 11 years deciding whether to write that sentence. I have decided it is the most precise thing I can say about what happened, and precision is the only obligation I have left. The Council's order to begin evacuation was issued at hour 22. By that point, a third of the installations in the inner Hezith system had already gone silent, and there were 312 Vrethkai settlements with a combined population of approximately 180 million that had not yet been reached by the cessations. The evacuation order called for the immediate departure of every vessel capable of independent navigation. The order was transmitted through what remained of the communications network. Not all of it reached its recipients. We know, from the subsequent count, that 942 people are aboard the Orveth Naz. The population of the Vrethkai continuance at last census was 412 million. The mathematics of this I will leave unstated. The archive contains the census figures. Anyone who reads this can perform the calculation. I will not perform it here. The Orveth Naz departed under emergency protocols and entered transit before the cessations reached our primary shipyard. We were fortunate in the timing. I have not used the word fortunate in 11 years without immediately recognizing what it means to use it in this context, which is that 942 people were fortunate and 412 million were not. The captain of the Orveth Naz, a man named Vrethkai, who had been 3 days from retirement before the evacuation order, made the navigational decisions that got us out of the Hezith margin and into open transit. He is still on this ship. He does not talk about the navigational decisions. I do not ask him to. The first months of transit were, I am searching for the right word and deciding there is no right word, so I will use the accurate one, difficult. There were 942 people on a cargo conversion vessel designed for operational crews of 300, most of them in varying states of shock, all of them aware that they were among the entirety of what remained of their civilization, none of them with any clear destination, because the Vrethkai continuance had not, as a matter of prior planning, designated a rallying point for the extinction of everything it had built. This was not an oversight that reflected poorly on anyone. No species maintains a detailed evacuation protocol for total civilizational extinction. The assumption, which is a reasonable one until it is not, is that the scale of a civilization's infrastructure provides its own redundancy, that enough will survive any given catastrophe to constitute a continuance worth maintaining. We were 942 people on a single ship in open transit, and we were the entirety of the Vrethkai continuance, and we had 11 months of supplies and an archive bay full of records that I was the only person qualified to organize. I want to say something about those 942 people, because the archive is largely a record of the civilization they came from rather than the civilization they are building, and a final entry that did not address them would be an incomplete record. They are not a uniform group. They were never uniform. The Vrethkai were not a uniform people, and the accident of proximity to a functional ship during the evacuation did not produce a representative sample of our civilization's range. What the Orveth Nas carries is an assembly of people who happen to be in the right places at the right moments. Crew members of the ship itself, researchers from the nearest academy campus, administrative staff from the Heseth orbital station, families from 2 residential settlements that lay along the evacuation route, a delegation from the Torveth Assembly who had been visiting our outer systems for a trade conference and found themselves aboard our last departing vessel. 41 of the survivors are not Vrethkai at all. They are the Torveth delegates, and they have been, across 11 years, the most complicated presence on the ship, not because of any conflict, but because they are the only people aboard who had a home to go back to and chose to remain with us instead. I have not asked any of them to explain that choice. I do not think the explanation would be simple, and I think the simplest and most accurate explanation is that by the time they could have departed to their own transit home, 11 years had passed, and the Orveth Nas had become the only home they had that still felt like home. This is the thing about 942 people living in close proximity in a ship built for 300, in transit for 11 years. You stop being strangers to one another. Not gradually, the way strangers become acquainted in ordinary circumstances, through accumulated casual encounters and shared minor events. You stop being strangers all at once, in the early weeks, because the scale of what you are all carrying erases whatever distance ordinary life maintains between people. 942 people who know they are the last of something are not capable of remaining strangers to one another. There is not enough space, in the physical or the emotional sense, for that kind of distance to be maintained. I have watched people find each other on this ship. I have watched the children of survivors form the first cohort of Vrethkai who have grown up knowing nothing of the continuance, except the archive and the stories. I have watched the hydroponics section become the closest thing to a public space the ship has, the place people go not because they need to tend the plants, but because the air there smells like growing things, and growing things remind people that time is continuing rather than stopped. Orveth Vaz tends the long crop section every morning 4th cycle, with a methodical care that looks exactly like the care he brought to cartographic analysis, and I have watched him from across the bay and thought that precision is a quality that survives its original context. It survives what happened to its context. It continues. I began organizing the archive records on the 4th day of transit. Not because I was not grieving, I was, but because organizing was the thing I knew how to do, and doing it gave me a reason to be in a room with a defined purpose and a sequential task, which in those early months was the only form of order available to me. The archive bay became, over the following weeks, the quietest room on the ship, and the quietest room on the ship became, over the following months, the room where people came when they needed quiet. I did not object to this. The archive was, in some sense, all of us. It seemed correct that we should all be near it. The organizing took longer than I had estimated. This was not because the cores were damaged. They were not. They had survived the evacuation protocols intact, but because organizing a civilization's complete records while that civilization is in the process of becoming aware of its own incompleteness is a task that resists the kind of clean sequencing that archival work normally permits. Every section I cataloged required me to know what was no longer there to cross-reference. Every citation in the scientific archive led back to an institution that no longer existed. Every biographical record I verified was a life whose continuation I could not trace, because the continuation had ended in the Hezith margin and I had no records of the ending. I cataloged what I had. I noted in the index what should have been there and was not. The index of absences is nearly as long as the index of contents. I consider it part of the record. I want to describe the archive briefly, not because its physical description is important, but because describing it is one of the last acts of care I can perform for it. The Vrethkai Archive is stored across approximately 4,200 data cores, arranged in 3 rows of floor-to-ceiling housing units along the archive bay's starboard wall. The cores are physically robust, designed to survive pressurization failures, radiation events, and minor hull impacts, with a theoretical data retention half-life that exceeds the current expected lifespan of the Orvith NAS by a factor of several hundred. The archive contains, as of this entry, a complete record of the Vrethkai continuance spanning 2,200 years of spacefaring history. The census records, the exploration logs, the diplomatic correspondence, the scientific publications, the cultural registers, the legislative archive, the biographical records of approximately 14 million individual Vrethkai whose lives were documented in sufficient detail to be included, and the operational records of every installation we built beyond our original home system, including the cessation chronicle I mentioned earlier. It also contains, in a separate and sealed section that only I have the authentication credentials to access, the 11 seconds of transmission from the Aperture's second contact, the transmission that arrived through the Orvith NAV's channel that was not a survey report. I have sealed that section. I will not unseal it in this entry, or in any entry. When I seal the archive, it will remain sealed under authentication credentials that will expire with me. I have documented this decision in the archive's index, with sufficient detail that any future reader will understand what the sealed section contains and why it is sealed. The reason it is sealed is this. I reviewed the content of that transmission once, in the early weeks of transit, when I was still in the phase of believing that understanding it would be possible, and that understanding it would tell me something I needed to know. I reviewed it once. I did not review it again. The decision not to review it again was not a failure of scholarly courage. It was a decision made by a scholar who had reviewed the content once and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from direct encounter with a thing that resists categorization, that continuing to examine it would not produce understanding. It would produce exposure. And exposure, in the case of this particular content, was not something the archive's remaining users, myself, eventually, perhaps, the 942, eventually, perhaps, whoever finds this record after us needed to experience. I sealed the section. It will remain sealed. If you are reading this record and you have found the sealed section and are wondering whether to attempt to access it, do not. I say this without drama, without the performative solemnity of a warning designed to increase curiosity by demonstrating its own gravity. I say it as a simple informational note from an archivist to a reader. The sealed section should not be accessed. The reason it should not be accessed is the same reason the Ithari boundary notification was issued and never explained. Some things are not explained because the explanation is the demonstration. The Orveth Nas has been in transit for 11 years, 4 months, and 7 days. We are currently approaching the outer edge of the Torveth Assembly's established space, not the center of the Assembly's territory, which is not reachable at our current velocity with our current supplies, but an outer settlement cluster where we have, over the past 3 years, established preliminary contact and received preliminary approval to petition for what the Torveth call foundational status, the designation given to a displaced civilization seeking to reconstitute itself within the Assembly's administrative framework. The Torveth have been cautious with us. I use the word without any particular bitterness. Caution is appropriate, and I understand the reasons for it. We are 942 people with a complicated recent history, requesting the right to establish ourselves within another civilization's established space. The Torveth have legitimate questions about the circumstances of our departure from the Hezith margin, and we have answered those questions as fully and precisely as we can, and the Torveth have listened carefully, and after 3 years of preliminary contact, we have received the preliminary approval. It is more than some species would have offered. It may be everything we needed. I intend to donate a copy of the Vrethkai Archive to the Torveth Cultural Repository upon our arrival, excluding the sealed section. The Torveth historians who will receive it will have access to 2,200 years of a civilization's accumulated knowledge. The science, the art, the exploration records, the diplomatic history, the census figures, all of it, preserved in the robust cores that were designed to outlast the civilization they documented. There is something I find important about this. Not comforting. I no longer have a precise vocabulary for comfort, but important in the way that precision is important. The Vrethkai existed. What we built and thought and mapped and recorded was real. It deserves to be held somewhere other than the memory of 942 survivors on a converted cargo vessel. I have one more thing to say about designation Verath before I seal this record. I have thought about whether to say it, and I have decided that the archive's obligation to precision requires it. In the months after our departure from the Hezith margin, I spent considerable time reviewing the Ithari boundary notification, the original, including the authentication data and the transmission metadata that most readers would not think to check, which I checked because precision requires checking everything. In the transmission metadata, which is the technical record of how a communication was prepared and sent, there is a field called the reference index, a list of prior communications that the sender considered relevant to the current message. Most diplomatic communications have 1 to 3 entries in the reference index. The Ithari notification had 47. I cross-referenced those 47 prior communications in the Vrethkai Archive. 11 of them were communications we had received from the Ithari in the ordinary course of diplomatic exchange, routine matters, nothing relevant to the Verath sector. 36 of them were communications the Ithari had addressed to recipients other than the Vrethkai, other species. In some cases species whose current status I had to research to determine, and in 3 cases species whose current status was not available in any record I could access, which is the archival designation for a species that no longer exists. All 36 of those other communications had been sent before ours. The earliest was dated, by Ithari calendar, approximately 1100 years before our notification. 1100 years. The Ithari had been issuing this notification in one form or another to various species for at least 1100 years before they sent it to us, and we had received ours, and we had spent 300 years discussing what it meant. I have no conclusion to draw from this that I am willing to state as a conclusion. I am recording it because it is a fact, and the archive's obligation is to facts. Whatever you make of it, you should make of it precisely, not more, not less. The Ithori have been maintaining this boundary for at least 1100 years longer than we knew. They have sent this notification to at least 36 other recipients. 3 of those recipients no longer exist. The 3 whose records I cannot access. I do not know their names, because their records are not in any archive I can reach, and a species whose records are unreachable is a species that has been absent long enough for its documentation to disperse or decay. I do not know how many of them received the notification and, like us, spent centuries deliberating its meaning. I do not know how many of them found a Devath Sorvek precise, methodical, cautious, who looked at the data they had assembled over 900 years of careful observation and concluded, in good conscience and with sound reasoning, that a research aperture at safe observational distance was a measured and responsible approach to a question the galaxy had posed and never answered. I know only that their records are not reachable, and that the Ithori have been sending this notification for at least 1100 years, and that the Ithori sent it to us, and that I am the last archivist of the Vrethkai continuance, writing the final entry of the Vrethkai Archive aboard a converted cargo vessel carrying 942 survivors toward a borrowed future at the edge of someone else's space. The aperture is still there. I assume this because nothing I have been able to verify suggests it was removed. The Orith Nav, which carried it to the installation site, has not been seen or contacted since the 19th hour of the event, and I do not expect it will be. The aperture array itself, the physical hardware, the paired transmitter and receiver, positioned 2.3 light-years from the inner boundary of designation Verath, I expect remains at its installation coordinates. We did not remove it. We could not have removed it. We were gone before we had the means to go back. I think about the aperture sometimes during the quieter cycles of the transit, when the archive bay is empty and the cores are running their routine integrity checks, and the ship's systems produce that low, methodical sound that I have come to associate with the passage of time. I think about what it is doing, sitting at the edge of the Ithori's boundary. Receiving nothing, presumably, because the sector remains as it has always been, quiet, untroubled, the ruins on the viable worlds unchanged, the thermal signatures continuing. I think about whether the aperture is still calibrated to receive. I think about whether it could receive something again if something were to be sent through it. I think the answer is probably yes. The hardware was built to last. Our hardware was always built to last. I do not think anything will send through it. I do not think designation Verath requires the aperture for anything the sector cares to accomplish. What happened did not happen because something in that sector wanted to reach us. It happened because we built a channel into a space that had a property we did not account for, the property of being already connected, already capable, already present in any instrument that claimed to observe it, the way a reflection is already present in a mirror before you hold it up. You do not create the reflection by holding up the mirror. You create the encounter. We created the encounter. The last entry of the Vrethkai Archive is being written in the archive bay of the Orith Naz. Outside the archive bay, 942 people are going about the ordinary business of living on a ship in transit, preparing meals, running maintenance cycles, educating the children who have been born during the 11 years of transit and who know the Vrethkai continuance only as a thing their parents describe, a vast and careful civilization reduced by the time they came into it to the dimensions of a cargo vessel and a borrowed future. Those children are Vrethkai. They carry the designation. What they do with it in the space the Torvith have agreed to offer us will be the next record. I will not be its archivist. Someone younger will take that obligation on, someone for whom the archive represents a foundation rather than an account. I hope that archivist understands what they are holding. I hope they read these records. I hope that when they reach this final entry, they find it has told them something precise and true. The Vrethkai were a careful people. We made one error in 2,200 years of spacefaring history. The error was not that we thought we were invulnerable, or that we believed ourselves superior to the boundary, or that we discounted the Ithori notification because we thought we knew better. The error was smaller and more human in its shape, more Vrethkai, I should say, because it is our word that should stand here. The error was that we believed observation and intrusion were different things. That seeing could be done without being seen. That a channel through which information flowed in one direction was a channel that only went one way. We built the aperture, we pointed it at the sector, we held up the mirror. I am sealing the Vrethkai Archive with this entry. The record ends here.